Good morning, and thank you all for being here for this time with Brian Tillman, this forum on peace and justice. I'm grateful for his presence. But first, a word of appreciation to Ron Reames and Sarah Reames. Ron has actually been the one in contact with Brian and said, "Why don't we have Brian here?" And I said, "Sure, I'd love to have a Sunday off from preaching." And it just so happened that Duke had the 9 o'clock tip-off last night, so even better. No, this was done way in advance, but I'm grateful for both of these members of Christ's body for being here. Ron, I'm going to allow you to elaborate a little bit and tell a little bit about what's going on, and then introduce Brian. But thank you all for being here.
I am Ron Reames, relatively new member here. I have to tell you this story. We have a Sunday school class, and there was a member in our class who, she's a black woman, and she was walking across the Kroger parking lot, and some fellow in a pickup, I believe it was a white guy, yelled a racial slur at her. And our class felt like, hey, this is ridiculous in this time and day. We need to do something. And frankly, we didn't know what to do. So I started looking around, and there's a book that I happen to like very much, Be the Bridge. But I felt like we could do some kind of ongoing, or at least start something to examine some of these issues. And it's best done if we have some black folks and white folks who are talking and really feeling the pain, and you'll hear why that's important from Brian's sermon at 11 o'clock if you haven't already heard it. There is pain involved in racial reconciliation. There's no way around it. And part of the pain is talking honestly and perhaps making new friends with people from other areas. I wanted to tell you that story, and I wanted to thank the folks who actually did all the work. Right before, I invited Brian, that's true, but then I took off for Virginia, and my classmates, Royce and Tim and Davina, actually did all the work, and we would love for you, if you have some interest in this ongoing process. We're going to start something. Jane has been involved in a lot of racial reconciliation things already, and she has a lot of friends from a black church just down the street, and we're going to somehow meld all this together. I'm not sure how it's going to happen, but what we would like for you to do, if you have an interest in it, there's a QR code outside here. If you will just look at that, take the survey. It's basically, I'm interested in ongoing. I'm not gonna lead a group or anything, but I'm gonna, just have a lot of different things to pick from to express your interest in this ongoing effort. Please do that. You're expressing some interest by just being here at this meeting, so we really want you to help us out, and we can do something about this racial prejudice that exists even here in Fayetteville. We want this to be an open situation so that Brian can answer questions. He's willing to do that. He is at the conference level for our conference and dealing with these issues. And part of what he does is come to churches like this and speak. So we were privileged to get him signed up to come here and speak to us. He lives in South Fulton, so he's not far away. So we're happy to have him here, and I think you'll enjoy his sermon. If you haven't already heard it, you'll enjoy hearing what he has to say. So please ask him questions. He'll give us a little spiel on some of the things that they've accomplished in the conference in this area. But we also want you to participate and ask questions. So,
good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you at Fayetteville First, and thank you to Ron and to Thomas as well for the invitation and the hospitality earlier this week as well on Tuesday and now today. Quickly, how many of you were here on Tuesday night when Reverend Dr. Gary Mason was here? Okay, great, good, a good number of folks. I was delighted that Gary was here. We were supposed to be leading a civil rights heritage tour in Atlanta and in Alabama that was canceled because right at the time where the cutoffs for registration were supposed to happen, Omicron surged in December and January. And so EO canceled that tour as a precaution, but he'd already bought his plane ticket, had all his things lined up, and so he was here. And so I was grateful that he was able to come, and with the invitation of Thomas to come and speak with you on Tuesday. Gary and I have done some collaborative work together here in Atlanta, in Florida, and I visited with him in Belfast, and he's just a remarkable human being. I was sharing with Thomas some of his work that should be just broadcast all over the world about some of the miraculous things he's able to do with groups of people who have been at odds and literally at war with each other to bring about peace and conflict resolution. That's sort of the role that I have for the North Georgia Conference. My title is Director of Inclusion and Advocacy. It includes doing things that help the conference be more inclusive in every possible way, including racial inclusivity. But that includes generational inclusivity, gender inclusivity, racial inclusivity, linguistic inclusivity, and so on and so on. And to also, whenever you have a title at the conference, you have your stuff you're supposed to do, and then a whole bunch of other stuff you get to do. So that includes that. One of my favorite things is to work with churches that want to have difficult conversations amongst themselves and with others in the church and in the communities where they are, like this one. And so I'm grateful every time I'm invited to be a part of those conversations. I don't force myself on. There's plenty of folks who ask and invite, and I'm delighted to come as I have here. I think what you want is to hear about some of the things that we're doing in the conference and then to field some of your questions as you have them. I would do my very best to answer those questions as I'm able. And whatever else you have, you can reach out to me after our conversation today and after the sermon. How much time do I have? Okay, great. Are those like 30 real minutes or 30 football minutes? Okay, all right. So one of the things that we're working on in the conference right now is there's a pilot academy that we started in January that will complete in May. And our hope is that after we evaluate what we've done there, that we can roll that out in a more broad way in the conference. But it's called the Racial Justice and Healing Academy. And so it's in a pilot phase. There's about 30 folks who are in that pilot now. They are Black, white, Latino, Asian, clergy, lay. There's one superintendent. There's someone from Extension Ministry in there. And they're going through these different modules together, these experiences together. They're doing some reading together, and they're in small groups together. And we're learning from this experience if this can be something that's effective for churches. And so we're excited about what's happening there right now and looking forward to that being shared more broadly in the conference. Some of the things that they experience together are workshops on something you may have heard of before called implicit bias. If you've paid attention to any diversity and inclusion stuff, you've heard this term out there, implicit bias. Implicit bias is, first, everybody has bias, okay? And bias is not necessarily a bad thing. Our biases in general is something that our brains do to help us categorize things so that we don't have to zero in and pay too close attention to them. We can just log that this is there and keep on rolling. So it's our brain's way of categorizing things. And so our brain produces these biases, if you will, some good, some bad, some completely neutral. It becomes a challenge when we have negative biases of people. And so we go through this round of experiences on implicit bias to help them understand what a bias is, how it presents itself, and how it can impact negatively our relationships with people who are different from us. And so one of the things we do, and the example that was used in this prior session is we asked everyone to tell us the very first thing that comes to your mind when you think about, don't edit it, the very first thing that comes to mind when you think about a koala. Anybody want to share? A koala. Koala. Soft. Australian. Teddy bear. Cute. Cuddly. Anybody else? Other things we hear, eucalyptus, so on and so forth, right? So we have, you've probably never been around a koala bear, perhaps, right? And so we have this bias, positive one, about koala bears, of which we've never really been in contact with. We've heard about koala bears or seen koala bears, and we have this impression about how they are. Well, I'm sorry to inform you that koalas are actually quite ferocious. They're not very cuddly. They don't like being cuddled. They are very hostile and vicious. And the reason that they are often seen eating eucalyptus is because they're given eucalyptus by the people handling them because it's a calming agent. So if you had this just blanket positive bias in favor of koalas and you saw one, you ran up to it and said, oh, it's a koala bear, look how cute. This is, that's essentially what bias is. It can be positive or it can be negative. But it's generally not necessarily something that's well researched, identified, or experienced, right? And so negative bias works the same way. We've heard something, we've seen something, but we really haven't encountered. And so then we have these assumptions in our minds. Everybody has them. Everybody has them. Everybody has racial bias, including me. There was this study at Harvard University where they produced this sort of a game. I'm not sure if anybody has seen this or participated in this before, but it's this little game you can play that helps you identify your racial biases. And so I'm playing this game of sorts, and it's showing you these pictures of differently raced men in this instance, right? So it shows you a white guy, black guy, Latino guy, Asian guy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it asks you to identify, it shows you two at a time, and then it asks you to identify which one of these is this or that or this or that. And so you kind of respond to it in that way. And when I got done with this assessment tool, do you know what it revealed about my racial bias? I, Brian Tillman, the Director of Inclusion and Advocacy for the North Georgia Conference, a 6'4", 200-pound guy, black guy, has a negative, slight negative racial bias against black males. How does that happen? It happens because I grew up in the same environment as everybody else. I watched the same television as everybody else. I listened to the same radio as everybody else. I went to the same schools as everybody else. And so the same biases that other people would have, I do too. Now, I'm very well trained. I have other biases too, but I'm very well trained on what to say and not to say, what to do and not to do. My biases are implicit. I am trained and controlled to not explicitly express those biases because I know they are wrong. It does not mean that I don't have them. So when I encounter people that I don't know or cultures that I have not experienced, I am constantly dealing with the biases that are in my head. Because if I don't, I will act upon them. And that is where a lot of our challenges come from. We act on these implicit biases that we are not aware of. So I want to talk about these two opposing things, intent and impact. I'm convinced that most people are good. They want to be good and they intend to do good. Sometimes our biases get in the way and cause us to do something we don't intend, but the impact of what we do is incredibly harmful. I intended to extend my patio in my backyard with my wife. And I intended for it to be really nice and level and even and to look just like the part that the builders did when they built the house. The impact of what I did, not so much, right? So I get an A for effort, but what I did was a hot mess in a lot of different ways. Intent versus impact. And so some of what I do is to help people to identify the impacts of some of the things they've done, said, or systems, policies, or practices that we have set up in our conference. One of the areas that comes into play often is in our ordination process. Several years ago, actually exactly 2017, I was the chair of the Conference Commission on Religion and Race. And so this is a group of multi-race people who help hold the conference accountable on things like the different systems and policies and things that we have set up. And so I did what I do every year. I asked the conference to share a list of those who are going before the Board of Ordained Ministry, how many passed, how many did not pass, what were the racial demographics, so on and so forth. And the reason for that is we often hear or heard at that time that we don't have very many people of color coming before the Board of Ordained Ministry. And therefore, it results in a small number of people of color who are on the stage at annual conference being ordained. When I pulled the list of the certified candidates, I'm using really exact language, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about, but the certified candidates are people who are eligible to go through our ordination process. So you call it a certified candidate. When I pulled that list, however, there were 96 total certified candidates. 51 of them were people of color. On the stage at annual conference, there was this small number of people. And so we needed to look and see, what is it that's causing us to have this large number of people in the system that are people of color, but they're not somehow getting through our processes? Things like that. I don't think the conference went around and said, hey, Board of Ordained Ministry, we only want you to ordain 3 people of color this year, okay? Didn't happen. They would never do that. The people who are at the conference level, I know these people. They are very kind, they are generous, they are grace-giving, they're loving, and they are disciples of Jesus. But we have, I shouldn't say but, and we have implicit bias. And so after we identified that this was happening, something crazy happened the next year. We had exactly the same number of people of color being commissioned as we had white candidates. And that has continued to pretty much stay close in sync, so that people who are in our system are able to get through now because we just became aware of a bias that we had, that we were judging people on their, for instance, preaching style based upon the one that we were accustomed to hearing. And so if they came in with a different style, then we kind of discredit the validity and efficacy of their preaching style versus another. Just one example of how that works out. The intent of the conference was never ill, but the impact was. You see how that works? It happens outside of the church as well. Personal story. I was doing a workshop at Oak Grove a couple years ago, and actually, let me restart that. That's irrelevant. My wife, who she's getting a lot of press today because I'm going to talk about her in the sermon a little bit too. But she was looking for a job several years ago. This was pre-pandemic, and she was looking for work, could not find a job to save her life. This was months and months and months, and decided to take a job really below her experience level just to get some work. And she did something that I would have never asked her to do. And if she had told me in advance, I would have absolutely told her not to do it. She went to her resume, took off her first name, exchanged it for an abbreviated version of her name that sounded more not black. The very first day she resubmitted that resume, she started getting tons of callbacks. And an interview that resulted in her getting a job, making double the money she was making at the other job when she wasn't getting any calls. The only thing she changed was her name from Shanika to Shauna. The only explanation for this is the person's looking at the resume had an implicit bias of ethnic sounding names. Do I think they're a horrible person? No. I think they have an unknown implicit bias they were unaware of. And it resulted in an incredibly difficult and challenging period of about 8 or 9 months for my family. Now, I know this sounds like, okay, well, good job. She got the job now, right? She had to change her name. And in that process, others who were looking for work at the same time and got callbacks because they had names like Jennifer and Melissa and Jessica and Janet had 9 months of income beyond what my wife had that she'll never get back. These things have lasting implications. This is the reality of racial injustice in our country. It's not necessarily because someone intentionally created or crafted a policy that has these negative effects. It's just simply the reality, mostly due to implicit bias. So this implicit bias experience and training is critical because it can help us when we are aware of the things that we might tend to do that are not based in fact. Like if you had a tendency to want to go to a koala bear and grab it and cuddle with it, that's not based in fact because you think it's, friendly and cool. In that instance, you get hurt, right? Most times when we have an implicit bias, somebody else gets hurt. And most often we are completely unaware. That's a good start. Any thoughts or questions from there? Yes, I see yours.
I'd like to share a story about this very kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up as
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges you identified is a couple of different things. One is how we define and understand fairness, right? Um, so I did one differential, the impact versus intent, or intent versus impact. Another one is fair and equal. Those are not necessarily the same thing, right? Hmm. Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So fair and equal. Fair is I shouldn't say is broader. Let me just give you an example. If I have 4 children, if I gave one of my kids, telling the kids I'm going to give them some allowance, right? And it's not based on age or anything of that nature. I just decide to arbitrarily give one kid $10, give another one 5, another one 5, and another one 2, right? And I do that for 6 months. The one that gets 2 complains incessantly. This is not fair. This is not fair. This is not fair. And then 6 months later, I decide, okay, she's right. I'm now going to take 5 from the one I was giving 10, and then make sure I spread everything around, and everybody gets the exact same amount. The one who I was giving to, who is now getting more and equal to her siblings, would still cry, not fair. Why? Because for 6 months, her siblings got way more than she did. They're now getting an equal amount, but that equal amount is not equitable. And so I have not brought her back up to the level that I set the other kids up at, right? And so fair and equal can be sort of tricky terms depending on the circumstances that are happening there, right? So if we're talking about, I'll stick with church analogies for this. We have oftentimes Korean candidates for ministry that come through the Board of Ordained Ministry, many of which English is not their native language. But if we require all of our candidates to write all of their paperwork in English, to do the interview in English, and to preach the sermon that's recorded to submit to the Board of Ordained Ministry in English, that is equal treatment across the board. Everybody's have the same expectation. But this Korean candidate has to filter everything first through Korean and then translate it into English and push it out, and then also make sure they try and remove as much accent as possible when they do so that those who speak English can understand what they're saying, so that they have a chance to pass the Board of Ordained Ministry. Equal, yes. Fair, no. And this happens, this is a real thing that we're dealing with, trying to figure out, how to make this more just. And we have the same challenges in our society. When you have a historical injustice, in order to make things fair, you have to go back and lift up the one to the level that you brought the others to before you try and give everybody the same thing, right? And so that's when you start to do things like that, the people who are accustomed to getting what they're getting, if they start to have to get less to bring up these over here, you're going to get a lot of complaints, right? And we hear those complaints all the time. Oh, if I said some of these words, y'all would be hot, right? If I said affirmative action, people feel a certain kind of way, right? People feel like, well, that's not fair. Why are you reserving slots for black and brown students at the university that then disadvantage the white students? This is something that has gone through our Supreme Court time and time again. I think there's still a case right now that's up before the Supreme Court on this very thing. So this is, it's painful. Getting to a place where our system, our country, our policies, our practices, all getting to a place where those things are equitable is painful. Yes. Yeah, and that starts with awareness of it. And I mean, I just confess to you my own bias. I mean, I don't act on it intentionally, but if I'm not careful, even I can do some really dumb stuff. I've already picked on my wife twice. I'm going to pick her on a third time now. I guess this time is going to make me look really bad. That same example of the paving of the cement in my backyard, right? So this is last summer. We started with a family friend who was helping us do it. Then he was taking way too long. It was driving me insane. And so I decided that, we can just do it ourselves. And so we looked on YouTube about how to pour cement, how to mix it, all the tools you needed, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I have all these just tons, probably 120 bags of cement in, our small SUV over like 3 cycles. And so you carry them from the back of the SUV, put them in the wheelbarrow and roll them to the other area, open the bags, you mix, stir, all this stuff, right? And it's like hot and beaming down, I'm sweating like bullets. And I get exhausted, right? And I say to my wife, all right, we're going to take a break because I'm tired, and so we're going to take a break. And she looks at me and she says, well, I understand you're tired, but you can take a break. Why do I have to take a break? And then I said from these lips, because you can't go to the car and carry those bags of cement, pour them into the wheelbarrow and mix them all by yourself and then pour them into the hole. And she looked at me and I knew immediately, ooh. And then I knew, 1, stop talking. 2, sit in that chair and you better not get up unless and until she tells you to. And that's exactly what I did. And I watched my 5-foot tall, I won't say how much she weighs because she'll get ticked, but she's really tiny. And I watched her carry those 60-pound bags of cement from the truck to the wheelbarrow, opened, dumped, mixed, and then poured, all with an attitude, looking at me the whole time like, what? That was my implicit bias of things that men can do that women cannot do that popped up. It popped up. That's what our implicit bias does. Do you know what a rhizome is? Okay. Rhizomes are, a good example of a rhizome is like kudzu, right? So kudzu is a rhizome that primarily is actually under the ground. Now, kudzu is a maniac and a terror. Trying to get rid of it is just impossible. They come and take over everything. But most of it is under the ground in these interconnected webs all over the place. So if you try to go into your backyard and start pulling all the kudzu up, you be pulling until you got to South Carolina and into the ocean because it's that sprawling. It's a rhizome. What we see of that system are these just pop-ups, which is a small, insignificant portion of the entirety of the rhizome system. Racism is just like that. Sexism is just like that. It pops up because it's really just all over and immersed in everything. We just occasionally see it when the shoots come up. And so we have to respond in ways that help to reduce those shoots from coming up, even while we know that under the surface, this is still there and present. Yes? Yeah, so resourcing is a challenge in a lot of different ways, but I would not discount, even though some places tend to have more resources for these things, the problem is just as prevalent. And so that's a challenge for us. Now, one of the fortunate things about the United Methodist Church is we're pretty everywhere. In fact, the United Methodist Church is in more counties in the United States than any other Christian denomination. We're everywhere, which is incredible. We're not all doing the same thing. We're not all committed to the same things. We are a very mixed and complicated group. And so we do the best we can with those who are willing, where they are willing. There are some places that are small towns, but they're doing good work with the resources they have. And there's some places that are big, huge, and sprawling, and they're doing nothing. They have all the financial resources and everything else, but they still, this is not something that people in large masses tend to want to address. It's easier to deal with an illness like this in somebody else, somewhere else, than to deal with it right where we are, right? It's everybody would rather take a magnifying glass to somebody else's life than to hold up a mirror to their own, right? The whole, Jesus, deal with the log in your own eye and instead of the speck in your, we have that on lock. We love to do that. And so it's really challenging to hold that mirror up and to see what other people see when they see us. And so one of the things that is something I try to make sure I do in all of these settings is to encourage churches to do the work in here before you go out there. If you go to, if I were to go to the state capitol and complain to the governor about systems of racism in our school system or in our health care or in law enforcement, but I haven't done anything as a pastor in the United Methodist Church, the governor would call me a hypocrite, and should, right? I mean, you've got to address your own stuff first. You deal with the challenges that you see in places where you have influence and power and authority. And then you can go someplace else. One of the greatest examples of that, just a couple weeks ago, I took the same group of folks in that pilot, took them with me on a trip I take every year. It's called the Civil Rights Heritage Tour. It's a 2-day trip. The one that Gary and I are going to do is a 7-day trip with EO, different trips. But this one is 2 days. And it kind of traces the actions and events that led up to the writing, passage, and signing of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. All right, so this is an act that made it illegal to suppress the vote based on race in the United States, all over the United States. That did not happen by a bunch of people going to D.C. and complaining to legislators there for change. This was a group, some of the names you know, some of them you don't. Dr. King, Joseph Lowry, who, by the way, is a United Methodist pastor. Jim Lawson, who, by the way, is a United Methodist pastor. And several other people, Amelia Boynton, John Lewis, just tons of folks. They started in this itty-bitty little tiny town in Alabama called Marion. Anybody ever been to Marion, Alabama? You have. Small town, right? Super tiny. That's where the Voting Rights Act started. They started trying to register black voters in Marion, Alabama, and caught incredible resistance there. Someone named Jim Lee Jackson was killed, and someone in Dr. King's group did the darndest thing. They went on television and declared that they were going to march from Selma, Alabama, which was about 20 miles from Marion, to Montgomery, Alabama, to declare that we needed voting rights. And all the civil rights leaders were like, what in the world? We're going to march where? How far? Are you out of your mind? But they said it on TV, so they had to figure out a way to make it happen, right? This person, Jim Lee Jackson, who was killed, when he was shot by the police in Marion as part of this protest, which, by the way, started in a United Methodist church in Marion, Alabama. They started there and started marching through the streets, and then the police and other people the police had deputized started chasing the marchers, beating them, so on and so forth. Jimmy Jackson was shot right behind that United Methodist church and was not dead. And so they got him, took him to the hospital in Marion where he worked as an orderly, and the hospital refused to take him. This is a trick question. Why did they refuse to take him? That's generally the answer. I'm going to do it a different way. Him being black wasn't the problem. The folks at the hospital being racist was the problem. They didn't accept him because they were racist. So they had to drive him 23 miles to Selma to a hospital that would take him. That's where he died, and that's why that 54 march took place from Selma to Montgomery. They marched, they tried to march across the infamous Edmund Pettus Bridge. Do you know who Edmund Pettus is? Quite frankly, yes. Edmund Pettus was the leader of the Ku Klux Klan for the state of Alabama. That bridge is still named for him to this day. That's the bridge where John Lewis, Amelia Boynton, and tons of others were beaten at the foot of that bridge. That's the bridge where John Lewis's skull was fractured at the end of it. And still, several days later, when they continued that march, guess who was among those marchers? John Lewis. He was in the hospital. He was determined to continue the march. The doctors had pleaded with him, don't do this. You can't march 5 days, camp out on the side of the road in tents and stuff and do this. And so they convinced him, because he was refusing to not go, they convinced him to have a car bring him back to the hospital in Selma every night, drive him back to where the marchers were in the morning so he can take every one of those steps. Why? Because the purpose of what he was doing was stronger than the pain and discomfort he was going to feel. That's a good spot to stop. The sermon is going to deal with some of this challenge of pain, and I look forward to being back with you, sharing and talking and doing whatever we can together to make positive change. Yeah. So right now, our plan is to pair one lay person and one clergy person from the same church in the same district to take part in this academy, and then take those learnings and experiences to their local church to help build a coalition of folks. Yeah, so late summer, early fall is when that first round will come. And I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to, because Dow is going to hold me to it. We're looking to start in this district. So thank you all very much, and I look forward to working with you in a few minutes.
Thank you, Brian. And there are sign-ups. There are physical sign-up sheets where you can put your name if you're interested. As Allison said, there's a QR code that you can scan. And there are conversations happening at the district level, led by other clergy persons and the district superintendent. So if you're curious, please reach out to myself or to Allison. We are reference points and facilitators in all this. This is our work to do together as the body of Christ. So thank you all for being here, and we'll see you in worship, or have a good day if you've already done the early service. Or you can come back to both.